It was a gray morning when the group of ecologists reached the farthest point of the road. There, surrounded by a dense forest wrapped in mist, stood Nick, Sarah, and Brian, each with their own reason for venturing into such a remote place. The trio, specialists in environmental conservation, were used to tough, isolated terrains, but this place felt different. There was an almost supernatural stillness, and the air was filled with the scent of damp earth mixed with something ancient, as if time itself had paused here. They followed a path marked by a stream of crystal-clear water, its winding course disappearing into the distance between giant trees with roots that twisted like living creatures. Nick, always curious yet cautious, led the way while Sarah snapped photos of the surroundings, and Brian noted details about the vegetation in his notebook. This was the last unexplored territory in the region, promising immense biodiversity, rich in species rarely seen by human eyes. After about an hour of walking, the group stumbled upon an unexpected sight, a moss-covered wooden bridge that led even deeper into the forest. The three exchanged glances, hesitating for a moment, but curiosity got the best of them. Without a word, they crossed the bridge and continued. On the other side, the trail was more overgrown, with vegetation so thick it felt as if the area hadn't been tread upon in decades, perhaps centuries. Soon, they spotted something extraordinary: old structures, almost hidden by the forest. These were primitive huts with stone walls covered in vines, as if nature itself was trying to conceal them. Nick walked over to the first hut, feeling the floor creak beneath his feet, noticing no signs of recent life. Sarah approached with her camera, documenting every detail, while Brian observed from a distance, frowning slightly. It was then that an odd sound echoed through the forest, a soft but unsettling noise, like the rustling of leaves mixed with a whisper. The three looked at each other, uneasy, but they pressed on. As they moved forward, they realized the huts formed a sort of village, scattered randomly among the trees. On some doors, there were wooden plaques with inscriptions in a language none of them recognized. The group was so absorbed by their discovery that they only noticed Brian's absence when it was too late. Nick turned to make a comment but found him missing. Sarah looked around, calling out for him, but it was as if the forest swallowed their voices, returning only the distant echo of their own words. A chill ran down Nick's spine as he tried to recall the last time he'd seen Brian. Was it just minutes ago, or had he been gone longer? Neither of them could tell. As the tension mounted, they decided to search for their friend, but the village seemed to stretch in all directions, confusing them. Each hut looked identical to the last, and time seemed to flow strangely there. As Nick and Sarah wandered in circles, calling Brian's name in vain, the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. Finally, after several failed attempts, the pair found themselves back at the bridge they had crossed. But when they looked to the other side, the trail was gone. In its place was a wall of trees, as if the forest had closed its doors, trapping them within. Looking back toward the village, they realized they were not alone. Shadows moved among the huts, indistinct, silent figures, like phantoms drifting among the trees, visible only at the edges of their vision. Nick moved closer to Sarah, his eyes fixed on the village. There was something deeply unsettling about this place, something that felt both threatening and irresistible. It was as if the forest had drawn them in and was now revealing its secrets, refusing to let them go. Nick's heart raced, and he knew that, somehow, the situation was far more serious than they had anticipated. They were trapped, and the search for Brian was only the beginning of something far larger and darker than any of them could have imagined. Nick and Sarah knew that to find Brian, they needed to search the mysterious village. But the forest seemed to toy with their senses, leaving them disoriented and unsure of every step. The structures around them were covered with a thick layer of moss and vines, as if nature was trying to hide them from prying eyes. The silence was deep and all-encompassing, broken only by the muffled sounds of footsteps echoing, though they couldn't see anyone else. As they moved forward, the village revealed itself to be larger than it had first appeared. Hut after hut, they called out for Brian, but found only emptiness, as if they were walking in circles. Suddenly, they heard a door creak. Turning around, they spotted a slender figure approaching slowly. It was an elderly woman, with hollow eyes and wrinkled skin, leaning on a makeshift cane of twisted branches. The old woman approached without a word, watching them with a look of curiosity and suspicion. When she finally spoke, her voice was raspy, almost a whisper, as if each word took great effort. Nick and Sarah exchanged hesitant glances, but they knew she might have some answers. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, her eyes fixed on Sarah, as if she could see right through her. "This place is not for outsiders." Nick tried to explain that they were only looking for a friend who had disappeared, but the woman shook her head, as if she knew more than she let on. She raised a trembling finger and pointed north, where the trees formed a kind of natural tunnel. "There," she whispered, "if he's still here, you'll find him there. But be careful. What you seek might not be what you wish to find." Without another word, the woman turned and disappeared into one of the huts, shutting the door behind her. Nick and Sarah took the path she had indicated, passing through a tunnel of trees and vines. The air was heavier, carrying a sweet, sickly scent, like flowers in decay. When they finally reached the end of the tunnel, they found a small clearing, where a peculiar structure stood out, a stone chapel that looked as if it had been there for centuries. Sarah moved closer, inspecting the ancient inscriptions on the stones, while Nick felt a shiver run down his spine. They were drawn to the partially open door, which seemed to invite them in. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through dusty stained glass, casting colored shadows on the walls. At the center of the chapel was a rough altar, covered with old relics and carvings resembling tree roots. On one of them, Sarah recognized the symbol of the last canopy that the old woman had mentioned. Nick tried to decipher the inscriptions on the altar, but the language was entirely unfamiliar to him. Sarah, with a serious look, took a photo, as if capturing the moment might help them understand. As they stepped back from the altar, they noticed that the space around them seemed to shift slightly, as if the room itself was closing in. Then, they heard footsteps outside and rushed to the door. To their relief, there was Brian, standing outside the chapel, looking at them with an expression of shock and confusion. Nick ran up to him, but as he got closer, he noticed something wasn't right. Brian was unusually silent and didn't seem to recognize them right away. His eyes were glazed over, as if he were in a trance. Sarah tried to speak to him, but he only shook his head, unable to form a coherent response. I saw something," Brian muttered, pointing toward the trees. "They're watching us. They've always watched us." With those cryptic words, Brian turned away, pulling Nick and Sarah along with him, away from the chapel. They followed him, but now a sense of urgency and dread hung in the air. The old village, with its abandoned buildings and silent inhabitants, seemed more threatening than ever. Nick knew that what they had uncovered so far was just the beginning, and that the answers they sought might be more terrifying than they could imagine. The forest enveloped them once again as Brian led the way back to the village, but he didn't seem the same. And as they moved away, the chapel disappeared into the vegetation, as if it had never been there at all. Yet something was watching them, a presence as old as the forest itself, inseparably bound to it. As they followed Brian, Nick and Sarah could tell he was agitated, but his gaze was distant, as if he were somewhere else entirely. They stopped in a clearing where he finally sat on a moss-covered rock, his hands covering his face. Sarah approached, placing a hand on his shoulder, but he remained silent for a moment, staring at the ground, as though trying to process something terrible. After a long pause, Brian looked up, his eyes still glazed but finally meeting Nick and Sarah's. "I saw a tree," he murmured, "a tree like nothing I've ever seen before. It was massive, imposing, and its roots seemed alive. It showed me images, things I can't explain." Brian kept talking in broken phrases, trying to convey the sensation he'd felt, but it seemed as if words weren't enough. Intrigued, Nick asked where he'd seen this tree, and Brian only pointed back in the direction they had come from. Driven by curiosity and a strange sense of duty, the three of them decided to return to the place where Brian had seen the vision. The vegetation seemed to part for them, revealing a path they hadn't noticed before. The trail was silent, the only sound the crunching of dry leaves beneath their feet. The air felt heavy, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for them to arrive at their destination. When they finally reached the end of the trail, there it was, the tree Brian had described. It was enormous, with branches stretching out like long arms, each one covered in deep green, pulsating leaves. On its trunk, dark sap seemed to glow faintly under the filtered light, casting strange patterns on the ground. They moved closer, almost hypnotized by the tree, which seemed to be observing them in return. Nick noticed that the roots formed intricate designs in the soil, creating faces and shapes that looked eerily human. Sarah, holding her camera, took a few photos but quickly stopped, unable to take her eyes off the tree. She felt drawn to it, as if something inside her recognized its presence. Brian, still in his own world, mumbled incoherent words, speaking of how the tree had shown him images of the past and the future. Sarah reached out and touched the trunk, feeling a strange tingling sensation shoot up her arm. She sensed an indescribable connection, a familiarity she couldn't explain. Nick knelt beside one of the roots and noticed something curious. Half buried in the earth was a small metal pendant, worn with age but still bearing legible inscriptions. He picked it up and showed it to Sarah and Brian, who leaned in to take a closer look. The pendant bore the symbol of a stylized leaf, and as he held it, a rush of emotions washed over him. It was as if the pendant carried memories, an echo of voices and lives long gone. They understood they were dealing with something beyond a simple discovery. This tree wasn't just a tree, it was a portal, a bridge between times and realities. Brian explained, with a look of awe, that the images showed the village and its inhabitants across different eras, as if they had always been there, guarding the secret. He believed that the tree, the so-called last canopy, was the guardian of this forest, a point where time and nature intertwined. Before they could fully process this information, they heard a distant sound. It was like the echo of voices, yet it didn't seem human. The three of them exchanged glances, and a sense of urgency took hold. Nick suggested they return to the village and try to learn more about what they had found. Something told them the answers they were looking for lay there, but they sensed that the tree wouldn't let them leave without something in return. They realized that, by getting involved in this mystery, they had become irrevocably bound to this land. On the way back, the path seemed darker, and the sounds of the forest were more intense. Sarah looked back and saw the roots of the tree moving slowly, as if they were alive, curling around the pendant that Nick had dropped. They felt as if the forest was watching them, as if every tree, leaf, and root was aware of their presence. And as they crossed the bridge once more, they felt a temporary relief, but they knew that the tree would be there, waiting for them, and that the answers were still to come. Nick, Sarah, and Brian continued down the path that had led them to the tree. As they made their way back to the village, they noticed that everything felt different. The silence was even deeper, almost suffocating, and the buildings, which had looked decayed before, now seemed even older, as if time had somehow sped up since they last passed through. With every step, they felt as though they were being drawn into the heart of a mystery that now felt less like an investigation and more like a mission. This time, they were driven by more than curiosity. They felt a strange obligation to understand what was happening here. As they approached one of the huts, Sarah stopped and noticed an inscription on the wall, barely visible beneath the moss. She brushed it away to reveal a design resembling the symbol she'd seen on the tree, a tangled network of leaves and roots forming what looked like an eye. It reminded them of the visions Brian had described, and they knew they were on the right path. They entered the hut, which was dark and smelled of ancient wood. In the center stood a rough table scattered with parchment, as though someone had left them there recently. Nick stepped closer and began to leaf through one of the scrolls, but the language was indecipherable, full of symbols and figures that seemed to dance under the glow of the flashlight. Sarah, looking over his shoulder, pointed out a drawing that resembled the tree they had seen. Beside it were a series of human figures, holding hands, their bodies connected to the tree by long roots. Brian began to pace around the hut, examining every corner. In one of the chests, he found an old book, its cover worn and tied with a leather cord. He opened it carefully, feeling as though it contained ancient secrets. The text was written in cramped, uneven script, but some parts were legible. He read aloud a passage describing the last canopy as the guardian of an ancestral power, something that maintained the balance of nature and, by extension, of humanity. This tree is the last of its kind, Brian continued reading, and its power lies in its connection to the earth. Those who find it are destined either to protect it or to destroy it. The choice will determine the future. As he read those words, a chill ran down Nick's spine. He realized that their role here was greater than they had imagined and that their presence was no accident. The atmosphere in the hut felt heavy, so they decided to leave, taking the book and parchments with them. As they returned to the village center, they spotted the same old woman they had seen before, standing in front of another hut, as if she had been waiting for them. She observed them in silence, but her eyes seemed to speak volumes. As they approached, she spoke in a solemn tone, "You have found the last canopy, and now you must choose. The tree cannot survive without guardians. And the old guardians, they are leaving." The woman pointed to a nearby tree, where shadowy figures appeared and disappeared, like phantoms vanishing into the wind. The trio realized that these were the souls of the former guardians, people who had, in some way, dedicated their lives to protecting this secret. As they watched, they felt the weight settle on them, a sense of responsibility unlike anything they had ever known. The silence around them was dense, and the air seemed almost suffocating. The woman pointed to a nearby tree, where shadowy figures appeared and disappeared, like phantoms vanishing into the wind. The trio realized that these were the souls of the former guardians, people who had, in some way, dedicated their lives to protecting this secret. As they watched, they felt the weight settle on them, a sense of responsibility unlike anything they had ever known. The silence around them was dense, and the air seemed almost suffocating. Without another word, the old woman turned and disappeared into the trees. Sarah, still holding the book, felt the weight of the choice they now had to make. She looked at Nick and Brian, who seemed equally torn between doubt and understanding. They knew that whatever they chose now would change not only the village but perhaps the entire surrounding area, as if every decision echoed through the forest. Before leaving, Sarah walked over to the tree one last time. She placed her hand on the trunk and felt the gentle, steady pulse. Something within her connected to that presence, and she understood that the last canopy was more than just a tree, it was an ancient consciousness, something that existed to maintain the world's balance. She looked at Nick and Brian and knew they felt it too. They were, in some way, the new guardians, and the forest was now a part of them. They stepped away from the tree, carrying with them the weight of everything they had learned. The answers were not yet clear, but they knew that something profound and irreversible had changed. With that, they left the village, knowing the last canopy would remain there, guarding its secrets, waiting for the moment when they might need to return. Leaving the tree behind, Nick, Sarah, and Brian felt compelled to explore more of the village, now with a deeper understanding. Shadows around them seemed darker, and the huts appeared to watch them as they walked by. They were more aware now of the role the village played, of its connection to the last canopy, and of how their choices carried weight. An even deeper mystery awaited, something they could feel in the very roots of this forest. That's when they noticed, among the huts, an entrance hidden by leaves and branches. Nick pushed the foliage aside to reveal a staircase descending into darkness. The trio exchanged uncertain looks, but they knew they had to continue. They descended in silence, each step creaking under their weight, until they reached a chamber dimly lit by small torches, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. In the center of the room was a stone altar covered in various artifacts, old wooden carvings, small containers etched with symbols, and a tapestry showing human figures connected to trees by long roots. Sarah examined it closely and realized that the faces of the figures vaguely resembled those of the villagers they had seen. Brian picked up one of the carvings and, turning it over, saw his own face reflected back in a distorted way, as if the object held some kind of power. Sarah pointed to an ancient book resting on the altar, a hefty tome with yellowed pages and almost illegible text. She opened it and found the same symbol she had seen earlier, the drawing of a vast tree with expansive roots. Below, the text described the story of the last canopy, revealing that the tree had been sacred for centuries, and that the villagers, chosen across generations, were its protectors. This responsibility passed down through the years, but now the old guardians were leaving, and new ones were being summoned. As she read, Sarah felt a wave of déjà vu. The words seemed familiar, as if she already knew them. Nick and Brian listened as she quietly translated the text. Suddenly, Brian stopped her and pointed to a symbol on the page, one that he recognized from his grandmother's necklace, an object he had always thought ordinary, but which now held a new significance. He realized it might not be a coincidence that he was here, and that his connection to the village could run deeper than he'd thought. Nick remembered stories his parents had told him about an ancient forest and a sacred sanctuary. He had always assumed they were just legends, but now he saw that all those stories shared a common root, connected to the tree. The group realized that their families, in some way, were tied to this place. It was as if they had been destined to find the last canopy, and their lives had been shaped for this very moment. The realization hit them hard, leaving them in a contemplative silence, weighed down by the gravity of it all. After some time, Nick suggested they take the book with them, but as he tried to lift it from the altar, a surge of energy filled the room. A spectral figure appeared before them, a woman in ancient garb, her gaze stern and intense. She raised her hand, pointing at them, and her voice echoed with a warning, "You are the new guardians. Protect the tree, or pay the price." The figure vanished, but her words remained etched in their minds, like an indelible mark. As the room returned to silence, they stepped back from the altar, feeling as though they had just been given a mission. The weight of responsibility was almost tangible, and they knew their lives would never be the same. Climbing the steps back up to the village, they felt an invisible force guiding them, as if the forest had chosen their fate. Upon emerging, they noticed the village looked different, more welcoming, as if they had passed a test and were now accepted. Knowing that their lives were inextricably tied to the last canopy, they prepared to leave, but deep down, they knew they couldn't stay away forever. They had discovered that their roots were deeply intertwined with the forest, and that, like it or not, they were now part of something much larger, a force that transcended time and life itself. Back on the surface, Nick, Sarah, and Brian walked away from the hidden staircase, processing the weight of everything they had uncovered. The silence around them felt watchful, as if the village and forest were waiting to see what the trio would do next. The responsibility now seemed almost overwhelming, and doubts began to arise, threatening to fracture the fragile alliance between them. As they walked toward the center of the village, Nick suddenly stopped and turned to the others. With a determined look, he announced that maybe the best course of action was to destroy the tree. "It's too much power to keep in one place," he said, his voice tense. He believed that the world needed to know about the existence of the last canopy, that such a thing shouldn't be kept hidden. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, but she could see that Brian was considering it. The air between them grew heavy, broken only by the murmurs of the surrounding forest. But Sarah couldn't accept that solution. She felt the tree was more than just a symbol, it was a living entity, and destroying it could unleash catastrophic consequences, something no one could predict. She tried to convince Nick and Brian that protecting the last canopy was the only sensible choice, but they were divided. Brian, who still seemed shaken by the experience in the underground chamber, stood back, watching both of them as he struggled to find his own truth amidst a web of doubt and fear. Their argument escalated. Sarah pointed to the impact that destroying the tree might have, while Nick maintained that the knowledge of the last canopy needed to be shared, that the world deserved to know about the tree's connection to humanity. Brian stayed silent, observing the debate, his gaze shifting back and forth between them as he tried to find clarity in the chaos of his thoughts. In the midst of their argument, they heard footsteps once more and saw the elderly woman they had met before. She watched them with a serious expression but did not intervene. It felt as if their decision was being closely watched, that any choice would carry a price. In that moment, Brian, seized by sudden clarity, announced that they could not let the world know of the tree's existence. He understood, finally, that this power was too ancient, too deeply connected to the village and the forest. To reveal or destroy the last canopy was to break a natural balance, and he wasn't willing to bear that burden. Nick, reluctant, looked at Sarah and Brian. He realized he couldn't sway them to his point of view, and slowly, he began to relent. Sarah's gaze was steady, and Brian seemed sure of his decision. Together, they decided to protect the tree, and in doing so, protect the secrets of the village. They knew this was about more than keeping something hidden. In a way, it was a pact, a choice that would bind them forever to the forest's destiny. The elderly woman approached them and, without a word, handed them a small, shining object, a key crafted from metal, engraved with the symbol of the last canopy. "You know what you must do," she said before retreating. Holding the key, they felt as though they had passed a test, that their decision had been approved by the forest itself. And so, they prepared to leave, aware that their mission had only just begun, and that, somehow, they would always be called back. As they left the village, the environment around them seemed to transform once more. The forest welcomed them, as if they were now part of an ancient secret, something that pulsed beneath the trees and under the soil. Though Nick still harbored doubts, he knew that this had been the only possible choice. They had accepted their role as guardians, and now, the forest was as much a part of them as they were of it. With the key in hand, Nick, Sarah, and Brian felt the weight of responsibility grow even heavier. They knew that the power of the last canopy was, in some way, now in their hands, and that the forest had accepted them as its new guardians. The walk back to the tree was silent, each of them deep in thought, preparing for what lay ahead. As they drew closer, they noticed that the tree seemed different, more alive, as if it were reacting to the choice they had made. The trio stopped in front of the immense trunk, which stood tall like a monument to time and the strength of nature. Nick placed the key into a small crevice in the roots, and suddenly, the tree began to pulse, emitting a soft glow that seemed to wrap around everything. It was as if the earth itself was waking up, responding to their presence. Sarah stepped forward and once again felt that familiar connection, a bond that now felt stronger, almost tangible. Then, before them, appeared the figures of the old guardians, now clearer and more defined. They formed a circle around the trio, gazing with serene yet intense expressions, as if they were there to witness the commitment the three were about to make. Each guardian seemed to carry their own story, and Sarah had the strange feeling that these former protectors, at some point, had also hesitated, doubted, and finally surrendered to the destiny that was now being offered to them. The voice of the elderly woman echoed in the clearing, even though they couldn't see her. "You have chosen to protect the last canopy. This choice binds you to the forest, to the cycle of life that it sustains. In accepting this role, you also accept the sacrifices it demands." The words resonated within their minds, as if they had been planted deep in their consciousness, and they knew there was no turning back. Each of them nodded, accepting the responsibility that had been entrusted to them. Brian stepped forward, reaching out to touch the trunk of the tree. He felt an energy course through his body, as if the tree itself was passing something on to him, an ancient knowledge, a distant memory. Nick and Sarah joined him, placing their hands on the trunk, and together, they formed a circle around it, mirroring the gestures of the guardians who surrounded them. It felt as though they were being welcomed by those who had come before, as if every fiber of the tree recognized the connection they now shared. The tree's glow intensified, and a strong wind began to blow, rustling the leaves and enveloping them in a whirlwind of light and shadow. They felt the weight of the forest, its stories and secrets, as if all those souls were merging with their own. The clearing seemed to breathe along with the trio, pulsing in harmony, until the wind stopped and everything returned to a nearly sacred silence. The old guardians had vanished, but the three knew they now carried their essence. As they stepped away from the tree, they felt different, as if something inside them had changed irreversibly. Nick still had his doubts, but he knew that these questions would accompany him always. Sarah looked up at the sky, seeing the first rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy, and felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Brian, meanwhile, kept his eyes fixed on the tree, as if saying goodbye to an old friend, something that would call him back but, for now, was at peace. Together, they left the clearing, with the feeling that the last canopy would be safe, at least for now. They knew the village and the forest would continue to guard their secrets, and that their role was just a small part of a much larger cycle. But they carried with them the certainty that they had made the right choice, and that, in some way, the forest would continue to thrive, protected by the new guardians it had chosen. As they left the clearing, Nick, Sarah, and Brian felt the world around them change. The forest seemed denser and more alive, as if nature itself had renewed its vigor. Each step felt like they were leaving something behind, but at the same time, they carried with them a new strength, a silent purpose that only they could understand. They didn't exchange many words as they crossed the village, simply glancing at one another with expressions that conveyed more than words ever could. The village felt emptier than before, and they noticed that the few inhabitants they'd seen earlier were gone. The huts were silent, as if they had never been occupied. Sarah paused in front of one of the houses, listening for any sound, but all she heard was the echo of her own breath. Nick realized that the village, like the old guardians, was vanishing as they walked through it, as if retreating to an invisible place hidden within the heart of the forest. When they reached the bridge, they felt an unexpected sense of relief, but looking back, they saw that the path they had taken was no longer there. Where the huts and clearing had been, there was now only a dense wall of trees, as if the forest had swallowed everything in a final breath. They knew that somehow, this was part of the process, and that the last canopy was now hidden in a place no one else could find. They walked back to the road in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. They felt that the world around them had changed, but they knew that the greatest transformation had taken place within themselves. The last canopy was now rooted in their memories, and the images of the village, the tree, and the old guardians would echo in their minds forever. Sarah carried the weight of a choice she knew was final, while Brian, with the pendant hanging around his neck, felt that his connection to the forest was deeper than he'd ever imagined. Nick, though he still harbored doubts, felt that their role was not yet over. They may have left the forest, but the forest would never leave them. As they left the area, he noticed something peculiar, a faint mark on his hand, an intricate pattern resembling the roots of the tree, a symbol of the commitment they had made. He looked at Sarah and Brian, and they noticed they bore similar marks, as if the last canopy had left an indelible reminder on them. As they walked away, a final ray of sunlight pierced through the trees, illuminating the path back to the road. The forest seemed to pulse, alive and watchful, seeing them off. Deep down, they knew that even if they tried to distance themselves, the last canopy would continue to call to them. They left the forest behind, but there were no goodbyes, only a quiet certainty that the tree's call would continue to echo through their lives, always reminding them that they were the new guardians of a secret as ancient as the earth itself.